the Interstellar Academy of Advanced Species, or IAAS, because even cosmic institutions love their acronyms, occupied a space station the size of a small moon, orbiting a binary star system that nobody could pronounce without at least 3 tongues. It was, by all measurable standards, the most prestigious educational facility in 7 galaxies, which was precisely 6 more galaxies than most species had even bothered to explore. Here, the brightest minds and strongest bodies from countless worlds gathered to prove one fundamental truth: that their species was objectively, measurably, scientifically better than everyone else's. The Academy didn't call it that, of course. They wrapped it in prettier language about celebrating diversity and fostering interspecies cooperation and building tomorrow's galactic leaders. But strip away the diplomatic veneer, and what remained was a sorting mechanism that would make any ancient caste system look like a participation trophy convention. Every student received a classification based on their species' evolutionary optimization index, a delightfully clinical term for ranking beings from clearly superior to how did you even achieve space travel? The system evaluated everything: physical capabilities, sensory acuity, cognitive processing speed, electromagnetic field manipulation, natural armor density, regenerative factors, lifespan, and approximately 300 other metrics that some committee of scientists had decided mattered. The results placed students into tiers, from alpha, reserved for apex species who practically glowed with genetic superiority, down through beta, gamma, delta, epsilon, and finally zeta, which was essentially a polite way of saying, "We're amazed you're sentient." Mira Chen occupied Zeta 7, the absolute bottom of the entire academy. She was human, which explained everything. The problem with humans, from a galactic perspective, was that they were aggressively mediocre at literally everything that mattered. Their homeworld operated at 1 standard gravity, pathetically weak compared to the high-grav species who could shrug off pressures that would flatten a human into a meat pancake. Their sensory organs detected only a narrow slice of the electromagnetic spectrum. No infrared vision, no ultraviolet, no magnetic field sensing. They couldn't echolocate, couldn't taste chemical compositions through the air, couldn't detect quantum fluctuations. Their reaction times clocked in at a sluggish 250 milliseconds. Their bone density was laughable. Their skin provided essentially 0 protection against anything more threatening than mild sunburn. They had no venom, no claws, no defensive carapace, no redundant organs, no regenerative abilities worth mentioning. And their brains. Oh, their brains. Adequate for basic problem-solving, sure. But compared to the Vexnari, with their parallel processing neural clusters, or the Quillari, with their crystalline computational matrices, human cognition was like bringing an abacus to a quantum computer conference. The Academy's evaluation had been thorough and devastating. Mira's species scored in the 23rd percentile overall, dragged down by bottom-tier rankings in durability, sensory capability, and raw strength. The report had actually used the phrase "surprisingly fragile" 3 separate times. So there she sat, in the back corner of Fundamental Physics 101, a class designed for species who needed extra help with concepts that alpha tiers absorbed during embryonic development. The classroom itself was a marvel of adaptive architecture, with seats that morphed to accommodate everything from the Tholmar's crystalline bulk to the Scree's floating gas forms. Mira's seat had defaulted to something resembling a slightly uncomfortable office chair. Her instructor, Professor Dralvik, was a Quillari, a species whose entire body consisted of interlocking energy matrices that gave them the appearance of a geometric prism that had gained consciousness and decided to teach. They were alpha tier, naturally, and possessed the barely concealed condescension that came with being objectively superior to 94% of known sentient life. "Today," Dralvik announced, their voice emanating from no particular location within their crystalline form, "we discuss gravitational manipulation technology. Now, I realize this may be challenging for some of you." Their form pulsed in what might have been the Quillari equivalent of a meaningful look toward the back of the room. "But do try to keep up." Mira resisted the urge to sink lower in her seat. 3 months at the academy, and the novelty of being the designated class idiot hadn't worn off so much as calcified into her daily routine. To her left sat Kex, a Crethian whose species evolved on a planet with 6.7 times Earth's gravity. He looked like someone had taken a bear, compressed it into a denser form, added an extra set of arms, and then decided that wasn't intimidating enough and threw in bioluminescent threat displays. Kex was actually decent enough for someone who could accidentally crush Mira's skull while reaching for a datapad. To her right was Vel, a Vexenari, whose species' claim to fame was telekinetic abilities that bordered on physics violations. She appeared vaguely humanoid. 2 arms, 2 legs, 1 head. But that's where the similarities ended. Her skin shifted through colors based on her thoughts, and right now it displayed patterns that Mira had learned to interpret as amused contempt. "Question for the human," Vel said, her voice carrying that musical quality that made even insults sound pretty. "If your species can barely withstand your own planet's gravity, how exactly did you manage space travel? Did you just build really gentle rockets?" Kex's shoulder plates rippled with suppressed laughter. Several other students turned to watch, because watching the Zeta tier struggle never got old. "We used math," Mira said, flatly. "Turns out the universe doesn't actually check your bench press stats before letting you leave the atmosphere." Vel's skin flickered through several colors that probably translated to various levels of incredulity. "Math that your slow-processing brains barely comprehend. I've seen your reaction times, Chen. You're nearly as slow as the Plaraxians, and they're barely classified as sentient. And yet, somehow, humans figured out faster-than-light travel only 3 centuries after discovering electricity." Mira countered. "How long did it take the Vexenari?" "Oh, right. You bought the technology from the Quillari after 20,000 years of stellar observation." Professor Dralvik's form pulsed sharply. "Miss Chen, perhaps you could redirect that defensive energy toward actually learning the material. I assure you, sarcasm doesn't generate gravitational fields." "No, but apparently neither does anything my species can do," Mira muttered. The lecture continued with Dralvik explaining gravitational manipulation with the enthusiasm of someone describing paint drying to creatures who couldn't perceive color anyway. Mira took notes, mostly because she'd discovered that diligent note-taking created the illusion of competence. The material was actually fascinating. The way certain technologies could create localized gravitational fields, how ancient civilizations had weaponized space-time distortions, the theoretical limits of mass manipulation. But it was hard to appreciate the lecture when half the class was watching to see if she'd need the simplified explanations. "And this," Dralvik said, their form brightening with what might have been excitement, "brings us to tomorrow's field study. We'll be visiting the Vault of Unbreachable Mysteries." That got everyone's attention. The vault was legendary, a museum housing artifacts that had resisted all attempts at analysis, use, or even basic movement. Objects from long-dead civilizations that seemed to operate on principles that current science couldn't crack. It was part museum, part ongoing research project, part admission that the galaxy's supposedly advanced species still had no idea what the hell they were doing half the time. We'll examine several items of historical significance, Drelvik continued, including the famous Graviton Mall, which has remained immobile despite attempts by over 300 different species to move it. Kex leaned forward, his massive form radiating interest. Didn't a Thalmar war chief try to lift it? They can manipulate their body density to increase mass. Indeed, the war chief generated sufficient mass to create a minor gravitational well of their own. The hammer did not move. In fact, nothing they attempted, including industrial magnetic lifts, anti-gravity fields, and quantum displacement, has had any effect. The artifact simply refuses to acknowledge the laws of physics we try to impose upon it. Sounds like the universe's way of saying, nice, try, but no, Mira said. Vel's skin patterns shifted to something that looked like laughter, rather like the Academy's evaluation of your species, human. Mira wanted to have a comeback ready, something sharp and witty that would shut down Vel's constant needling. But 3 months of being the cosmic underdog had worn down her defensive reflexes. Instead, she just returned to her notes, writing down Graviton Mall, immovable object, and underlining it twice. The rest of the class proceeded without incident, which meant Mira successfully avoided additional humiliation for 47 consecutive minutes, a personal record. As students filed out, she gathered her things slowly, having learned that letting the crowd disperse first meant fewer opportunities for casual species supremacy commentary. Chen? Professor Dralvik's voice stopped her at the door. A moment. Mira turned, already running through possible reasons for being singled out. Failed the last exam? No, she'd actually done okay. Disrupted class. She'd barely spoken, existed while human? That seemed most likely. I wanted to discuss your performance, Dralvik said, floating closer. Up close, the professor's crystalline matrix was mesmerizing, geometric patterns that shifted and realigned constantly. Your written work is adequate, sometimes better than adequate. Your mathematical solutions show competence, and yet I'm Zeta Tier because my species couldn't evolve decent bones, Mira finished. The classification system is based on measurable biological factors, Dralvik said, and somehow their toneless voice managed to sound defensive. It's not personal. Right, it's just science, very objective. Definitely not a way to make sure everyone knows their place. Dralvik's form pulsed with colors Mira had learned meant irritation. Miss Chen, I understand your frustration, but the fact remains that your species has significant biological limitations. The system doesn't rank worth. It ranks capability. There's a difference. Is there? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've built a hierarchy and then convinced yourself it's just neutral observation. This attitude is precisely why you struggle to integrate, Dralvik said. Perhaps instead of resenting the evaluation, you should focus on working within your limitations. There's no shame in being less optimized. Mira bit back her initial response, swallowed the second one, and settled for a tight smile. I'll keep that in mind, Professor. Will there be anything else? Dralvik dismissed her with a wave of light, and Mira escaped into the corridor before the conversation could deteriorate further. The hallways of the Academy were designed to accommodate hundreds of species simultaneously, which meant they were essentially massive tubes with gravitational paths for those who preferred floors and open space for those who preferred flying, floating, or existing as coherent energy states. Mira stuck to the walking path, watching as more impressive beings moved past her. A Quillari drifted by, discussing quantum mechanics with what looked like a living constellation. A pack of Crithians laughed about something in their bass-heavy language, their mass making the corridor vibrate. A scree floated past in their containment sphere, their gaseous forms swirling with patterns that might have been words. And there was Mira Chen, human, walking like a barely evolved ape because her species had somehow managed to get into space, despite being cosmically unimpressive. The next morning's field trip started with the usual chaos of getting 36 species onto a transport shuttle designed to accommodate all of them. Mira ended up wedged between a Tholmar who radiated waste heat like a furnace and a Lixian whose scales kept shedding onto her uniform. The 20-minute flight to the vault felt like 20 hours, filled with excited chatter from her classmates about the artifacts they'd see. The Vault of Unbreachable Mysteries was less impressive from the outside than Mira had expected, just a nondescript facility attached to a larger station. But inside, the carefully controlled environment held treasures that made her breath catch. They started with small objects. A cube that existed in 4 spatial dimensions simultaneously and gave most observers headaches. A ring that aged backward, growing newer as time passed. A blade that cut through space itself, leaving temporary rifts in reality. Each artifact came with a history of failed analysis and frustrated researchers. But the main event was in the central chamber. The Graviton Mall sat on a simple pedestal in the middle of an otherwise empty room. It looked like a weapon from Earth's ancient history. A massive hammer with a handle as thick as Mira's arm and a head the size of her torso. The metal, if it was metal, showed no signs of age, oxidation, or damage. It just sat there, looking like something a particularly ambitious blacksmith might have forged, except for the fact that it bent space-time around itself in visible ways. The Graviton Mall, announced their guide, an ancient Quillari named Instructor Vexthir, whose crystalline structure had gone slightly cloudy with age. Discovered 3,000 years ago in the ruins of the precursor civilization. Every analysis suggests it's simply an advanced weapon utilizing gravitational manipulation technology. And yet, despite our understanding of the underlying principles, despite having reverse-engineered similar technology, this artifact refuses to move. Has anyone actually managed to touch it? Kex asked, his eyes fixed on the hammer with something like reverence. Oh yes, Vexthir said. Anyone can touch it. Lifting it is the problem. The hammer seems to be locked into a specific gravitational reference frame. Not to the station, we've moved the station and the hammer stays with it. Not to the planet we originally found it on. Not to the star, system or galaxy. It's anchored to something we can't measure or identify. May we try? Vel asked, her skin already shifting to colors that indicated eager anticipation. That's precisely why we're here, Vexthir said. Advanced students attempting to move the mall has become something of a tradition, a reminder that even the greatest minds can encounter mysteries they cannot solve. What followed was a parade of failures so spectacular, it would have been funny if everyone wasn't taking it so seriously. Kex went first, his massive Crethian muscles bulging as he wrapped all 4 hands around the handle. The corridor filled with the sound of straining effort. The hammer didn't budge a millimeter. He tried adjusting his density, increasing his mass using leverage. Nothing worked. He stepped back whilst breathing hard, his bioluminescence flickering with frustration. Vel approached next, her telekinetic fields visible as distortions in the air around the hammer. She could move objects weighing several tons with her mind alone. The datapad demonstrations had been impressive, but the hammer ignored her entirely. She strained, her skin cycling through colors so fast it nearly strobed. telekinetic pressure building until the air itself seemed to groan. The hammer sat unchanged. A Tholmar student tried manipulating the local gravitational field. A Lixian attempted to alter the molecular bonding of the pedestal. A Quillari tried quantum displacement. 3 Scree worked together to create a pressure differential. Each attempt failed completely, utterly, almost mockingly. Professor Dralvik, who'd accompanied the field trip, floated forward. This is why the mall remains here. Not because we can't destroy the pedestal, we certainly could, but the hammer would remain floating exactly where it is now. We've tested this. The artifact defines its own position in space, and nothing we do changes that fundamental fact. Unless you're a precursor, Kex said glumly, rubbing his sore arms. Perhaps. Or unless you possess some quality the precursors deemed important. We've theorized that the lock might be genetic, or consciousness-based, or tied to quantum signatures we can't detect. Without more information, we're simply guessing. Mira had been hanging back, content to watch her classmates exhaust themselves. But Vel, recovering from her failed attempt, noticed her. What about the human? Vel called out, her skin displaying patterns that Mira had learned meant mischief. Shouldn't Chen get a chance? Maybe the precursors were looking for species with bottom-tier evolutionary development. Several students laughed. Kex looked uncomfortable but didn't object. Even Dralvik's crystalline form pulsed with what might have been amusement. Miss Chen, you're welcome to try, Vexthir said neutrally, though I should warn you that beings far stronger and more capable have failed. Yeah, I got that from the last 20 minutes of watching everyone fail, Mira said. But she stepped forward anyway, because refusing would just confirm every assumption they'd already made about humans being weak and scared and inferior. The hammer sat there looking unremarkably hammer-like. Up close, Mira could see the distortions it caused, the way light bent around it slightly, the subtle sense that space itself was denser near the artifact. It felt like standing near something impossibly heavy, except her eyes insisted it was just a hammer. Go ahead, Vel encouraged, her voice dripping with false sweetness. Show us how human determination overcomes physical reality. Mira reached out and wrapped her hand around the handle. The metal, if it was metal, felt cool against her palm. Solid, real, exactly like holding any other tool, except for the thrumming sensation that traveled up her arm. Not vibration exactly. More like the hammer was humming at a frequency she felt rather than heard. She pulled. The hammer lifted. Not dramatically. Not with a flash of light or a crack of thunder or any of the cosmic fanfare that should accompany an impossible event. It just came up, easily, naturally, like picking up a hammer that weighed maybe 15 pounds instead of being locked into an immovable position in space-time. Mira stood there, holding the Graviton Mall one-handed, while every being in the room stared at her in absolute, stunned silence. Huh, she said, because her brain had apparently decided that profound moments called for monosyllabic responses. The silence stretched. Kex's bioluminescence had frozen mid-pattern. Vel's skin had gone completely white, the Vexnari equivalent of a system crash. Professor Dralvik's crystalline structure had stopped its constant shifting. Even Vexthir, who'd probably seen everything in their long life, just floated there, radiating pure disbelief. Mira looked at the hammer in her hand, then at her classmates, then back at the hammer. So, is this normal? This feels like it shouldn't be normal. That broke the paralysis. Suddenly everyone was talking at once, moving at once, surrounding her with questions and scanning equipment and demands to explain what the hell just happened. Mira, overwhelmed and confused, carefully set the hammer back on its pedestal. It settled into position and immediately became immovable again. Kex tried to lift it. Nothing. Vel tried. Nothing. It had returned to its locked state as if nothing had happened. Except something had definitely happened. Miss Chen. Vexthir's voice cut through the chaos with the authority of someone who'd been teaching for centuries. Pick up the hammer again. Mira reached out, grabbed the handle, lifted. The hammer came up smoothly, that same thrumming sensation traveling through her grip. Set it down. Step away. Kex, try again. Kex tried, failed. Mira tried, succeeded. They ran through variations. Mira could lift the hammer anytime she wanted. Nobody else could, regardless of whether she'd just been holding it or not. The harder hammer's immovability applied to everyone except her. This is impossible, Dralvik said, their voice having lost all its typical condescension. There's nothing special about human physiology that would... Actually, Vexthir interrupted, their ancient structure brightening with sudden interest. There might be. Come with me, all of you. Bring the hammer, Miss Chen. They moved to an adjacent analysis chamber, while Mira carried the hammer, feeling increasingly surreal about the whole situation. Vexthir interfaced with a terminal that looked older than some civilizations, pulling up data that made the displays flicker. The precursors, Vexthir said, were contemporaneous with early human evolution. We've known this, but considered it irrelevant. Humans were barely sentient at the time, still confined to one planet, utterly unremarkable. But what if that was the point? What point? Vel asked, her skin finally regaining some color. The precursors didn't leave this weapon for advanced species. They left it for humans, specifically. Or rather, for beings with human-specific traits. Vexthir pulled up comparative biology data, highlighting sections that made Mira's head hurt. Most species in this galaxy evolved to specialize. High-gravity worlds produced strength. Low-gravity worlds produced efficiency. Hostile environments produced armor, toxins, redundant systems. But humans evolved on a world that was moderate. Not too high gravity, not too low, not too hostile, not too gentle. And so humans became generalists, adaptable, persistent. That doesn't explain, Dralvik began. Persistence, Vexthir emphasized. Humans are persistence hunters. Your species literally evolved to chase prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. You can't outrun anything over short distances, but over long distances, very few Earth creatures could outlast a human. And that's not just physical, it's neurological. Human brains are wired for pattern recognition over extended periods. For planning days, weeks, months ahead, for seeing connections across timescales that other species miss. The instructor pulled up more data, this time showing neural scans. The Graviton Mall doesn't just test strength or power, it tests consciousness. Specifically, it tests for a type of temporal awareness that most species lack. Most beings experience time as a series of discrete moments. But humans experience time as a continuous flow. You remember the past, imagine the future, and exist in the present all simultaneously. Your brains literally can't help but track patterns across time. So the hammer is looking for... what? Species that can think ahead? Kex asked. Not just think ahead. The lock appears to be quantum temporal in nature. It requires someone whose consciousness naturally exists across a temporal spectrum. Most species process reality moment by moment, with memory and prediction as separate functions. Humans integrate them. Your experience of now includes elements of past and future in a way that most beings' consciousness doesn't. Vexthir gestured at the hammer in Mira's hands. The precursors designed this weapon for a species that hadn't evolved yet. They needed beings who could think across time, who could persist through challenges, who could adapt to circumstances rather than specialize away from them. They needed generalists with temporal consciousness integration. They needed humans, Mira said quietly. More accurately, they needed the traits humans evolved. There may be other species with similar consciousness patterns. We'll need to test. But in this region of space, humans appear to be unique in this regard. The implications settled over the group like a blanket. Mira looked at the hammer in her hand, then at her classmates who'd spent 3 months treating her like the cosmic equivalent of a participation trophy. So, she said slowly, the species you ranked dead last in evolutionary optimization is actually the only one in this room who can use precursor technology that you've been studying for 3,000 years. The silence that followed was delicious. Vel's skin went through several colors before settling on something that looked like embarrassment. Kex's bioluminescence dimmed. Dralvik's crystalline structure developed several stress fractures. The classification system, Vexthir said carefully, measures physical optimization for survival in hostile environments. It's not a measure of consciousness patterns or temporal integration or usefulness, Mira finished. It's a measure of how impressive you look on paper, not what you can actually do. That's not, Dralvik started. Professor, with all due respect, you just watched every Alpha and Beta tier student in this room fail to move an object that the Zeta tier human picked up one-handed. Maybe your ranking system is measuring the wrong things. She set the hammer back on its pedestal, where it immediately returned to being immovable. Or maybe, and I'm just spitballing here, maybe the precursors understood something that your 3,000-year-old civilization still hasn't figured out. That being optimized for one set of conditions makes you useless under different conditions. Specialists are great until the environment changes. Then you want the generalist who can adapt. The field trip ended early because half the Academy's senior research staff suddenly wanted to study Mira, the hammer, and the implications of both. The next week was a blur of tests, scans, and interviews. They discovered that approximately 73% of humans could lift the hammer, a success rate that no other species came close to matching. The temporal consciousness integration theory held up under scrutiny. Other precursor artifacts started revealing human-compatible interfaces that had gone unnoticed for millennia. Mira's status changed overnight. Suddenly, she was interesting instead of inferior, exceptional instead of inadequate. Her classification remained Zeta 7. The system's criteria hadn't changed after all. But now that ranking came with an asterisk that basically read, performs in ways the system can't measure. The first meeting of Fundamental Physics 102 had a very different energy. Vel approached Mira before class, her skin displaying patterns that might have been apologetic. I wanted to say, Vel started, that you're sorry for 3 months of constant mockery about my species being evolutionarily inadequate. Mira suggested. I was going to say I learned something, but yes, also that. Mira considered holding the grudge, but grudges were exhausting, and she'd already proven her point by casually doing the impossible. Apology accepted. For what it's worth, your telekinetic abilities are still legitimately impressive. Not impressive enough to move the hammer. Different tools for different jobs, Mira said. That's kind of the whole point, isn't it? Professor Dralvik entered the classroom. their crystalline form noticeably less condescending in its movement patterns. Good morning, class. Today we'll be discussing practical applications of gravitational manipulation technology, with a particular focus on consciousness interactive systems. Miss Chen, I believe you'll have insights to share. Mira settled into her seat, still the same slightly uncomfortable chair, still in Zeta section, and opened her datapad. The ranking system hadn't changed. She was still officially the lowest-rated student in the academy by every measurable standard. But now she was also the only student in 7 galaxies who could lift a 3,000-year-old hammer that bent space-time around itself. Funny how reality had a way of making measurement systems look stupid. Before we begin, Dralvik said, I want to address the recent events at the Vault. The discovery that humans possess unique capabilities has prompted discussion about reforming our classification system. Several faculty members have proposed adding measures for temporal consciousness integration, adaptive capability, and other factors that might better capture a species' full potential. Will that change anyone's ranking? Kex asked. Potentially. We're still developing the methodology. But it raises an important question. Are we measuring what matters, or simply what we can easily quantify? Mira raised her hand. Professor, with respect, I don't think you should change the system. That got everyone's attention. Dralvik's form pulsed with surprise. Miss Chen, surely you, of all people, would want. I want everyone to remember that your prestigious, scientific, objective classification system ranked me at the very bottom. And I'm the only one who could solve a problem you've been studying for 3,000 years. If you change the system now, people might forget that the original system was garbage. Better to keep it as a reminder that measuring impressive traits doesn't tell you who can actually do impressive things. The classroom fell silent. Then Kex's bioluminescence rippled with something that might have been laughter. Vel's skin shifted through colors that looked like grudging respect. An interesting perspective, Dralvik said, and for once their toneless voice sounded almost warm. Very well. We'll table the discussion about classification reform and focus instead on why our existing models failed to predict Miss Chen's capabilities. There's a valuable lesson in examining our blind spots. The lecture proceeded, and Mira took her notes like always, from her seat in the Zeta section, officially ranked as the least optimized student in the academy. She was fine with that. After all, 3 months ago, she'd been a bottom-tier human in a galaxy of superior beings. Now she was a bottom-tier human who could casually interact with technology that rendered every supposedly advanced species helpless. The ranking hadn't changed, but the context certainly had. And if there was one thing humans excelled at, one thing their moderate gravity, moderate environment, adaptable, persistent evolution had gifted them, it was the ability to change context until their weaknesses became irrelevant and their overlooked strengths became obvious. The galaxy had spent 3,000 years trying to force the hammer to acknowledge their strength, their power, their superiority. It had taken one unimpressive human about 3 seconds to just pick it up and move on with her day. Mira smiled as she took notes. Listening to Professor Dralvik explain gravitational physics to a classroom of beings who'd recently learned that understanding theory didn't mean you could handle practice. Somewhere in the vault, the Graviton Mall sat on its pedestal, immovable and waiting. A 3,000-year-old reminder that the precursors had known something the galaxy's current civilization was still figuring out. Sometimes the most valuable trait wasn't being the best at anything. Sometimes it was being good enough at everything. And sometimes, just sometimes, the species everyone ranked lowest was exactly the one you needed when reality stopped caring about your rankings. Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. The Stellar Confederacy had been governing the known galaxy for approximately 12,000 standard rotations, which was either an impressive achievement in political longevity or a damning indictment of how little had actually changed in all that time. Probably both. The Confederacy operated on principles that its founding members liked to call enlightened meritocracy, which translated roughly to, "We were here first, so we're obviously better than you." This philosophy had served them reasonably well, mostly because nobody had bothered to challenge it. And challenging ancient political structures required energy that most species preferred to spend on more productive activities like trade, exploration, or complaining about the Confederacy's decisions without actually doing anything about them. The governmental seat existed in a pocket dimension called the Nexus Point, accessible only through carefully controlled quantum gateways. Because apparently even the location of your capital needed to scream exclusive. The Nexus Assembly Hall was a masterwork of architectural intimidation, designed by species who understood that if you couldn't impress people with your policies, you could at least overwhelm them with real estate. The structure defied conventional physics in at least 6 ways, featured materials from 400 different worlds, and incorporated lighting that adjusted based on the collective emotional state of attendees, which meant it was usually some shade of smug purple. Representatives from 519 member species gathered here monthly to conduct what they called essential governance, but what mostly amounted to elaborate theater. Each species occupied a designated station, arranged in 7 ascending tiers, with placement determined by a complex algorithm that factored in length of membership, economic contribution, military strength, and how many times your species had hosted the annual summit without complaining about the cleanup costs. The founding species, the Kethran Directorate, occupied the lowest tier closest to the central platform, because in Confederacy logic, proximity to the action equaled importance. Everyone else ascended outward and upward in decreasing relevance. Humanity occupied Station 417 in the 7th tier, squeezed between the Yarvix Collective, whose primary export was existential philosophy nobody asked for, and the disputed territories of Braxis 9, who spent most sessions arguing with themselves about internal politics. This placement was the Confederacy's polite way of saying, "We acknowledge your existence, but please don't expect us to care." Earth had been granted provisional membership exactly 3 standard rotations ago, following a bureaucratic process that involved 14,000 pages of documentation, 600 hours of testimony, and at least one incident where a human delegate had asked if anyone had actually read the membership bylaws, causing a minor diplomatic crisis when the answer turned out to be, not recently. The human representative arrived through the quantum gateway at precisely the scheduled time, which marked her as either hopelessly naive about Confederacy customs or deliberately making a point. Punctuality was considered somewhat gauche among species who measured their lifespans in centuries and viewed time as more of a suggestion than a requirement. She materialized on the 7th tier platform wearing a navy blue suit that looked positively minimalist compared to the ceremonial garb, bioluminescent displays, and gravitational field manipulators that passed for formal wear among the other delegates. Her auburn hair was styled in a practical twist, her face composed, her posture suggesting someone who knew exactly where she was and had decided not to be impressed by any of it. The assembly hall thrummed with pre-session activity. Delegates socialized in carefully orchestrated patterns that looked casual, but actually followed complex protocols about who could approach whom and in what order. Holographic displays floated throughout the space, showing everything from economic data to celebrity gossip from 14 different civilizations. The ambient lighting cycled through self-satisfied purples and oranges, occasionally spiking into smug gold when someone made a particularly well-received observation about their own species' accomplishments. High Chancellor Vethric, a Kethran whose species resembled what might happen if you crossed a spider with a philosophy professor, and gave the result a superiority complex, activated the ceremonial resonator to call the session to order. The device emitted a harmonic frequency that translated across all known perceptual spectrums, which was impressive but also slightly nauseating if you happened to be standing too close to it. Several delegates made small adjustments to their translation matrices and sensory filters. We convene the 942nd monthly session of the Stellar Confederacy, Vethric announced, his vocalization creating visible ripples in the air around his speaking platform. Today's agenda includes resource allocation disputes, the Meridian Trade Corridor expansion proposal, updated protocols for first contact scenarios, and the continued provisional assessment of species designation Terra Human Sol 3. The way he pronounced humanity's designation made it sound like a clerical error that everyone was too polite to correct. A subtle shift occurred in the Assembly's attention, several hundred beings suddenly remembering that humans existed and were technically present. The human delegate didn't react to the scrutiny, merely folded her hands and observed the proceedings with the patience of someone who had learned that alien bureaucracy moved at speeds that made continental drift look hasty. The first 2 hours proceeded according to standard Confederacy protocols, meaning with all the urgency of continental erosion. The Quarex Federation disputed mining rights with the Silicon Concordat, producing geological surveys dating back 4,000 rotations and arguing about interpretations of pre-Confederacy territorial agreements. A species whose name sounded like wind chimes and meant the luminous inheritors of cosmic wisdom presented their annual report on nothing in particular, but with such elaborate vocabulary that it took 40 minutes. The Meridian Trade Corridor proposal sparked a debate about whether expanding commercial routes would disrupt traditional shipping patterns, which somehow evolved into a philosophical discussion about the nature of progress. Through it all, the human delegate remained still, watching, learning the rhythms of this cosmic theater, taking mental notes that would later be filed in reports that approximately 4 people on Earth would actually read. Then came Agenda Item 23. The matter of provisional status review for Terra Human Sol 3, Vethric announced, and suddenly the diffuse attention of 519 species focused with laser precision on the tiny platform in the 7th tier. A Dracorian delegate named Sarthax rose from his 3rd tier station. The Dracorians were a reptilian species whose scales could shift colors to express emotion, social status, or threats, depending on context. Right now, Sarthax displayed aggressive patterns of crimson and black that suggested he was about to enjoy himself immensely. High Chancellor, I bring formal review of humanity's provisional status, along with concerns about their suitability for continued Confederacy membership. The floor recognizes Sarthax of the Dracorian sovereignty, Vethric replied, settling into his seat with the air of someone about to watch an entertaining show that he definitely hadn't helped orchestrate. Sarthax activated a holographic projection system that materialized above the central platform, displaying various images and data compilations. Honored delegates, where does one even begin with the human question? In the 3 rotations since their admission, humanity has demonstrated a consistent pattern of behavior that raises serious questions about their readiness for civilized galactic society. They disregard established protocols, their technology borders on primitive, and their approach to virtually every situation ranges from baffling to actively concerning. Murmurs of agreement rippled through several tiers of the Assembly. Specificity would be appreciated, Vethric prompted, though his tone suggested he already knew and approved of what was coming. Gladly. Sarthax's hologram shifted to display a human starship. 8 months ago, the human vessel designated Columbus made first contact with a Confederacy survey team in the Kepler 442 system. Standard protocol for such encounters is clearly outlined in the First Contact Handbook, Section 7000 through 7093. The procedure involves sequential communication attempts using mathematical principles, followed by carefully structured exchanges of cultural information, culminating in formal introduction only after mutual understanding is established. The entire process typically takes 6 to 8 standard days. He paused for effect. The human captain skipped all of that and immediately transmitted, "Greetings from Earth. Anyone want to grab coffee?" Coffee. As if centuries of carefully developed diplomatic procedure could be replaced with caffeinated beverages and casual pleasantries. Several delegates made sounds of disapproval, ranging from clicks to subsonic vibrations. "Their vessels," Sarthax continued, warming to his subject like a prosecutor who'd been saving his best evidence, "are constructed using what can only be described as primitive metallurgy. Welded alloys, mechanical fasteners, chemical propulsion for maneuvering thrusters. We've analyzed their engineering specifications, and in at least 3 documented cases, human ships included components held together with an adhesive polymer they call duct tape. Our material scientists initially thought this was a translation error until we confirmed that yes, humans actually use reinforced fabric tape for emergency repairs on vessels traveling at faster than light velocities." A Kethran council member leaned forward, her crystalline features refracting light in patterns that indicated fascinated horror. "Perhaps the humans are simply economically disadvantaged. They are a newly spacefaring species working with limited resources. Limited resources they squander on the most inefficient endeavors," interjected a luminary delegate, whose form resembled concentrated light given consciousness and apparently strong opinions. "They dispatch research expeditions to catalog stellar phenomena we fully documented 6,000 rotations ago. They establish colonies on marginally habitable worlds instead of focusing on optimal environments. They produce artistic and cultural works at a rate that suggests their entire civilization is perpetually distracted from more productive activities.